click off. This will click off pretty soon. This is our theory meeting on the 11th of July, Monday, and this will click off fairly soon because I was recording some stuff over the weekend that you want to transcribe very soon. This is one of this, like the other ones I gave you the other day. The other tapes were not important to do right then and there. This one's important to do because it really takes a lot of the stuff we were talking about here. And in about 20 minutes while I was driving on the freeway between here and San Diego, covered all that very concisely. Of course, it drove everybody else in the car crazy. Everyone's listening to the radio.
Well, yeah, you bet. As soon as I get the dictionary out of the way, I think...
Right, that's number one. That's priority uno. I hate this chair. Okay, first thing we have to do is figure out where else to put this chair other than this room. So, you know, find something. Yeah, find... Right after the dictionary, get rid of the chair, and then do the transcribing. I hate this chair. Okay. Don't mind him. What do you think?
I'm going to transcribe it. How do I spell that?
Yeah. It's going to be a problem. Well, I'll let Katie transcribe that part, okay?
Okay.
Anyway. All right. So, when we're talking about carrying this out into the real world and making real things out of it and getting the holistic experience of even understanding it. One of the notions, and we'll get a little philosophical here, we'll show how this impacts religion, and we'll show why it's not religious, okay, at the same time. And someone wanted a definition of God. Is there a God? If somebody asks mental relativity, when someone asks you, are you a God, you say, yes, Ghostbusters. Now, when somebody asks if there is a God, you say maybe. You say yes and no is what you say because, in fact, regardless of personal beliefs, from a mental relativity perspective, if we're talking about the essence of self-awareness, how do we know that we exist? Well, as a, I guess it wouldn't be a subset, but as a lateral set of that, does God exist? Would be a question that self-awareness asks as soon as it becomes aware. As soon as we are aware of ourselves, we ask, is there anything bigger than us that knows more? You know, is there anything that plans what appears to be chaos? Because the minute we define order by what our understanding of things are, then we want to say, is there a greater order that describes the chaotic nature of the universe and environment around us? And indeed, there is a greater order, but the problem is you can't get there from here. As long as you're trapped in your own self-awareness, you can only order things that are within your capability to order, which means seeing 3 dimensions from standing on 4. But there's an infinite number of dimensions because the more we see, the more there are. We create them as we embody them. As a result, you could say that the closest thing we would have to, quote-unquote, a concept of God from mental relativity would be whoever occupies the next dimension stands in the 5th dimension and watches 4, because they're not bound by time. And as a result, because they aren't bound by time, they can leap what we would consider forward or backward, and alter things to change the state of the current reality so that time becomes an object. It's no longer something that flows. And because it doesn't flow, that means that you can change the meaning of something now by changing something that happened earlier, and all of the context shift in reality actually never was the way it is because time is just another building block. However, that would have to be played against the measuring stick of the 5th dimension, whatever the heck that is. Because that 5th dimension then would be the linearity. Something has to be the linearity someplace. It has to be the single direction. It has to be the vector. And if you don't put it in the 4 and control those, it'll be in the other one. Someone once said that if you had a 4th dimensional surgeon, they could go and do surgery on the inside of the body without breaking the skin. You know, which is really intriguing because effectively they would see the body at every place that it is at all times. They would see all the existences. Now, look how chaotic we are if you match us against space and time. If you look at us and define us only spatially, you say, this is who I am. If you look at it as a single moment in time, this is who I am here, and I'm the same person here. But if you look at time as not something that's flowing, but you look at time as something that is constantly only one moment, then what you essentially have is you have me both here and 2 steps to my left, and all the distance in between. And the longer I stay in one place, the more intensely I exist in those points. But you'll find me in San Diego, you'll find me in Canada, you'll find me in Mexico, and you'll find me not exactly as I am, but in a slightly different state because I'm constantly evolving within myself. But those are different fractal levels, okay? Because if you look at somebody and define them as saying, there they are, and therefore, because they are that definition, then you can see them move across the room, and you can say if time were 1 moment, they would leave a vapor trail across time, so that if time were just as important as anything else in defining somebody instead of just defining them spatially, suddenly we would see the person as a streak rather than as an embodiment, because they would exist, and they would exist more firmly in the areas, that they occupied for a longer duration, more firmly in a space-time continuum sense. That's why we separate space and time in mental relativity, because that's a paradox we don't run into in mental relativity, because time and space can change independently of one another. Now, when you look at the religious aspect of that, of standing back and seeing the whole thing, that theoretically, one of these little spirals that we talked about that spirals around, and the concept was we take a bunch of fibers and we make them into a spiral to create a piece of twine. When we hold the spiral that we've created in this piece of twine, that is one dimension in mental relativity. It's one dimension because we're dealing so far up, we've actually got a three-dimensional object. Okay, so that's the first dimension, is looking at a three-dimensional object. Now we take that and we coil the twine. And now in our minds we can imagine that here is this coil, which is a spiral, kind of like a slinky. And we stretch this out, we can see this slinky of twine. But we also know that there's a spiral wrapping around the twine itself. So we've got two spirals going. One spiral laterally along the twine, and another spiral that is spiraling the twine itself. And that's something that you'll see on the beginning of this tape. It also has that, he's still running, yes, it still has that information at the top, and it's really comparing a lot of these things in a rather concise way, so that'll be pretty handy to use. That's 2 dimensions. Now, when you take those 2 dimensions and you take this twine, which has the spiral along it laterally, and you spiral the whole thing into a coil, and then you take that coil and you put it into a big spiral around, now all of a sudden you've got something where you can just kind of barely picture it, but you can hold all that in your mind. You can see the spirals going laterally at the same time that you're seeing the spiral of the shape, and at the same time you're seeing that going around. That's kind of like at the edges of the capacity to keep all of that going in your mind at once. Now try and coil it one more time. Okay? And you can't do it. You just can't do it, because if you imagine a larger coil, coiling the coil that coils the coil, as soon as you do that, you lose track of the first one that goes laterally along the twine. And if you try and hold on to that one that's laterally along the twine, then you're going to lose the capacity to go one step higher and see that big coil that spirals around. That's because that's the 4th dimension. The 4th dimension of processing, not the 4th dimension of existence. People look at dimensions in our traditional science as being places. It's like stupid, but they're looking at it spatially. Here's this place. Here's this state. We call it a dimension. Now we'll move to a higher plane of existence. We'll go into another volume if you're really thinking, enlightened. You go into volumes. Now here's this new volume we're creating, and they get into all these concepts, but they're all structural concepts. They're all spatially oriented. However, if you look at processes as objects, then this little spiral is the only thing you could really call a process. If you make a circle by looking at it on the end, you look at the end of this spiral, and just like a slinky, you look down and you see a circle. That's trigonometry. You see a particle. You look at it sideways, you see a wave. And so we look at photons and we say, here's a particle and here's a wave. It has those 2 natures. Okay, it is a particle sometimes and a wave other times, okay, or it is both a particle and a wave, depending on how you look at it. Well, that's a little closer to it, but what it really is a spiral going through one more dimension than we perceive it in. Light is not just a quantum. Light is not just a packet of probabilities. Light is also a qualum. It contains both quantity and quality. So you have a quantum and a qualum aspect. But quantum mechanics is something we're inventing here. Nobody knows that yet. Quantum mechanics is our little baby. And so it's again. What?
Are you inventing the word qualum?
Yes. Yes. That is the one we have coined.
Qualum.
And now what you end up with is when you say, let's look at quantum mechanics, we can describe the quantity 2 ways. We can describe its mass and we can describe its energy. That takes care of quantity. But if we want to get any hint of quality, then we have to look at it in terms of its temporal sense, what's going on in terms of process. And when we look at process, we can look at this spiral. And we can say this is an ongoing process because it's not just a projection of a repeating item in one dimension. It is now something that's going in the other direction. And as you take this, you can see in the spiral that if you have a certain length that you assign to it from the beginning of the spiral through maybe 6 or 7 loops to the end of the spiral, and that is a slinky type spiral. It's not a flat spiral that just goes out like an Archimedes spiral. It's one that's going to be actually a coil. And when you take that coil like a spring, it has a certain amount of metal in it if you take a bed spring. Now, if you squash it down, it widens out. If you pull it out, okay, it's going to narrow in. And so there is a relationship between the breadth of these coils and the length of the coils that can be there. So getting back to our original concept of what would God be in mental relativity? Can we say there is a God? Well, the fact is that we are on this spiral, and we're spiraling around, and all we can do is look to the future and to the past to see it as a particle. And we can look to the present, and we can look to progress and see it as a sine wave. What we can't see is the spiral itself in real life, because we don't have that view from on the spiral. We have to stand out and look at it at a 3/4 angle in order to see that. As a result, this thing spirals around. Our lives are going around it. What are we circling around? Well, if you want a God, there he is. It's the force that is at the center that defines the spiral. How wide, how long, what direction. Essentially, we don't have to have faith, but if you want to see it, you're going to need it. Because you really can't see it. And so if you want to see what's there, you never will. That is the Tao that cannot be spoken. Okay? The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. The Tao that defines how wide it is going to be, how it undulates, whether it gets wider loops or narrower loops, and how long the whole thing goes, those are the things that we cannot control. They appear to be chaotic to us. The effect that's manipulating that, if there is a greater order, that's the only way we can sense its impact, is in the chaos of our lives. So you don't sense God working in through mental relativity in terms of things that are ordered to you. You see God working in terms of chaotic aspects of your life, which of course is, where they get the idea of miracles from. A miracle is something that violates known order.
Why describe a greater order to it rather than just chaos?
In the sense of a greater order of magnitude, because we're talking about moving up dimensions in this case. Now you can move down dimensions and say, what can we not see beneath us? For example, if you are killed by a bacteria, okay, it is just as deadly as if you're killed by a car. One of them you didn't see coming because it was outside your range of vision, your scope. And the other one you didn't see coming because it was outside your limits of resolution. So chaos has two natures and two ends of the spectrum. One, things that are too large to see, and one, things that are too small to see. And if we imagine our self-awareness as a boxcar on a set of tracks, we can move that boxcar so that we can see larger things or see smaller things, but just like our example with the coil, we can never see more than the length of the boxcar on the tracks. We don't have the vision to look farther or down below. The point is, we can move up and examine what's directly beneath us on this boxcar, and from that we can believe that it will be that way when we return, but it never really is. If it is exactly the way we expected it to be when we return, it's because chaotic forces have acted to neutralize each other and mess it all over the place while we were gone, then bring it back to where it was when we see it next, and we perceive that as continuity. Okay? And so when chaos is working in a form that gives us repetition, whenever we see repetition, and it's, the old slapstick comedy routines where somebody's making a face or something next to somebody, and they turn around, every time they do, they're sitting here innocently, and then as soon as you turn their back to the person, they give them, the tongue and the wiggly ears and everything. Okay, that kind of thing is they never actually see. They might suspect that something is going on because it's something else they see in their environment that is impacted by this expression, like other people's reactions maybe, or the sound of the person changing their hands to wiggle their ears and bring them down, and they can scared, a little swish, and they know something's going on, or just because it's too quiet for nothing to be happening. Okay? And so you begin to hypothesize, you get into speculations, and you get into projections, and you get into all kinds of questions, and this is how we try to learn about God. We want to know who's out there wiggling their ears at us, you know? The thing is that we can't, because whenever we look, it's not there. That's the whole nature of the uncertainty principle, and it's the whole nature of the spiral, and it's the whole nature of the paradox that exists in our lives because we have both a spatial and a temporal sense. If we only had one sense, if we only had 3 dimensions, then as far as that question of space versus time, we wouldn't have a problem because we wouldn't have time. There'd be no time sense. But then we find the paradox below that in mass and energy. We could say, well, gee, sometimes it looks like energy and sometimes it looks like mass, you know, and so how are we going to ever understand what's really, it's a paradox, it's mass and it's energy. Well, we can understand that very well through Einstein's work. We can clearly understand that energy just doesn't act upon mass at one fractal level, but it actually can be transformed into mass at another fractal level of appreciation. And as such, we look at that and we say, okay, we can understand mass. It's just this thing that sometimes is energy and sometimes is material. Okay, that's fine. But then we can understand at the level that we're operating now is how can it both be particle and wave at the same time, but one dimension more, that would make sense, and something else would be not making sense. The reason it has to not make sense is first of all, when they talk psychology, they get into a lot of trouble, especially Priestley and all these guys who are talking about the little operator sitting in the top of the head making things happen and the main decision maker. All this stuff they're talking about requires there to be a pre-existing purpose. Somewhere, at some level, high above everything else, there's got to be a purpose, an intent. Because if there's no intent, then nothing can happen. Well, this is where mental relativity differs, is that its model of showing how the biochemistry creates self-awareness requires no intent at all. And I'll go over that a little bit today, too, before we finish, is to show how this is the first model of psychology that doesn't require there to be a reason. So that a lot of people say, well, if you want to have a creature that's going to survive, yeah, okay, well, who's you? You know, then you build them this way. If you want to have a creature that can triangulate on the universe, this is how traditional science would approach mental relativity concepts. If you want to have a sentient being that can triangulate on the universe so that it can see both the way things are ordered and also the way they're changing, well, then you have to look at one and then the other. First you look at space and then you look at time, or you look at time and then you look at space, and then you get a sense of the view of the way things are at the moment and also the way they're progressing, and that allows you then to be able to predict the way things are going and to take action before things get bad and happen that you don't want, or to be able to take advantage of things that happen that you do want by conserving your resources for what you expect to occur. That's traditional explanation of it, but it requires a preordained purpose. It requires
problem solving. It's like if you have a problem.
Exactly. If you wanted to create a creature that would do this, how would you go about it? Well, you do it like this, you know. And so that explains why, you know, there's a spatial and temporal sense. Well, it's baloney. It doesn't. That's 3D.